Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we're going to be sharing some creepy ghost stories for your listening pleasure. Don't forget to press the bell, like and subscribe. But for now it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I have a few stories I'm going to share. I work at a nursing home and would pick up extra shifts on my days off, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., or would sometimes work doubles. I worked on 2 wings. One night, while working in the west wing by myself, it was around 3 a.m., and I heard a wheeled walker, the kind with the wheels on the front and the little rubber stops on the back, coming up the hallway to the nurse's station. Thinking it was a resident wanting a pain pill, as some of them would walk up instead of ringing their call bell, I sat and waited, hearing the walker wheels on the tile hallway floor. And after a while, I thought to myself, they should have made it to the nurse's station by now. It's not that far of a walk. I got up from the desk, looked out to the door into the hallway, and nothing. There was no one there. As soon as I stood up and got close to the doorway, the noise stopped. I was so confused that I did rounds, checked on every person in every room, even empty rooms, and every resident was asleep. And every empty room was just that, empty. One evening, between 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. shift, 2 other aides were with me, sitting at our round table, chatting in the front room. This is within the nurse's station. Our nurse's station is split into 2 rooms with a big open wall between them. We have a very large med cart right inside the second room of the nurse's station, and you can see it from the round table. It's diagonal from it, right through the doorway. And we're all talking when all of a sudden we hear a weird scraping noise. We all look over towards the med cart where it was coming from, and our styrofoam cup full of plastic spoons went flying off the med cart with force, strewing the spoons all across the room. I got up and put the cup back. The cup had Velcro on the bottom and was Velcroed to the top of the med cart, so when we pushed the cart around it didn't tip up and spill. I picked them up and put them back. I tried hitting the cup to see how easily it could get knocked off, but it couldn't. You literally had to use force to pick it up, and you couldn't knock it over. We were all so excited, and there were only 20 minutes left of our shift, and we couldn't wait to leave that night. I was then working on a different wing for a while. There was a room in this wing called the Blue Room, which was 4 doors down from the nurse's station, on the same wall of the nurse's station. I was with a co-worker almost finishing our shift. It was around 10 p.m, and there's a piano in the Blue Room, and I kid you not, it began playing. It was quiet, as if someone were barely pressing on the keys. I got up, thinking one of the residents got out of bed, couldn't sleep and wanted to do something, and they're allowed access to this room at any time. The closer I got to the room, the more quiet the piano played, until I got up to the room and turned on the light. As I did so, it immediately stopped playing. I stayed close to my co-worker and vice versa for the rest of our shift. During a day shift around 1 p.m. or so, every room has a call bell. They're just like a light switch with a small hole in the actual switch part, with a long sturdy string attached, so that the string can reach their bed, chair or floor in case they fall over or need something. To switch it on or off, you have to give it a good yank or it won't switch on. When switched on, the call bell rings loudly. You can hear it the whole length of the long hall, and we have a lighted number board right in front of the nurse's station on the opposite wall, so that when we're at the station sitting at the desk, we can see it right in front of us. Whichever room call bell is flipped on, It will blink on said room number on our board. All doors also have a pretty big light right above them. If the resident's call light is on, this light will also blink. Residents just got back from lunch, and room 126 call light is going off. I got up, then thought to myself, room 126 has no one in it anymore. He had recently passed away about a month prior. I thought maybe someone walked into the wrong room, but who knows? Old people do weird things sometimes. Or maybe someone from maintenance was doing something and needed help. Some of my residents do have early onset dementia and Alzheimer's, and sometimes forget which room is theirs. I go to the room, go to open it, and it's locked. I get the keys out my pocket, open the door, and all the lights are on, and the call light is still ringing/turning on. I turned off all the lights and the call light. I thought maybe the string got stuck in/around the small nightstand below it, causing it to turn on. The small nightstand was the only furniture in the entire room. Family left it for us to reuse as they didn't want it. I moved the dresser to the opposite wall to make sure there was no AC or heat turned on, and took the string off the call bell. My boss heard it go off. Her office is right next to the nurse's station on this wing, and asked me if whoever rang it was okay. I said yes, and explained what happened. Not even a minute after my explanation, it started to ring a second time. Same exact thing. I went to the same room, unlocked the door. The lights were all on, even though I know I turned them off, and the call light was ringing. I flipped the switch, turned off all the lights, locked the door, and shut it behind me. My boss followed me in this time, and was just as unnerved as I was. Nothing more happened, and we got a new admission that next day that moved into the room. The next and final thing was one of the creepiest I've ever encountered. Black-eyed creeping teenagers, but we'll get to that. You see, we had a double room with two people in it, a mother and daughter. The mother was 98 but in pretty good health, besides a fall the year prior and her diabetes. The daughter was 66 and had small seizures/epilepsy and would have falls often. They both moved around pretty well with their walkers though. Their call bell went off one night, but only for a few seconds, just long enough for me to look up and look onto the call light board to see the light flashing for their room number, which was 133A, for the first half of their double room, where they have a living room set up. If the light went off for 133B, that would have been the second half, either the call light in the bathroom or in between their beds. I went back to check on them. They were both sound asleep, snoring, and the last time I did rounds at midnight, they were asleep then too. I brushed it off as a malfunction or something. I short-shifted myself, so I was working a double, and had worked this said night from 11 to 7 a.m., then working into the next day 7 a.m. to 2 p.m. I got off an hour early for picking up this shift since we were short-staffed. So it's now 7 a.m. and I start doing my rounds, waking everyone up, starting at the top of the hall, room 121, and going to the clear end of the hall, room 133. I go to the mother-daughter room and wake them up. They're both already awake, which is unusual. They like to stay up later than most of my residents and have a hard time getting up in the morning. I wish them good morning, go get the mother's IQ check to see how her sugar is and how much insulin she'll need. And she begins telling me, "You need to tell Elsa those teenagers to stop crouching down at our living room window all night." Mind you, this is the only 98-year-old I've ever met with a mind so sharp. She was still 100% completely with it, and I asked her to elaborate and tell me what happened. She said that every night this week, right when they crawl into bed, they can both see shadows outside their living room curtain and can hear people knocking and tapping on the glass. They can hear them having conversations with each other and laughing excessively, sometimes for up to 5 minutes continually. She told me it's 3 teenagers. She said the first night it happened, they kept saying, "Please let us in. We're cold, and we need to use your phone and call our mum." She also said the last night she got up out of bed and turned on the light and looked out the window, she was going to yell at them. She could see their shadows standing up only inches from the window, and when she went to open the curtain, they crouched down again underneath it. She also explained that the previous night, when she opened the curtain for the first time, she only turned on the small lamp on the other side of the room and saw their faces peering in the window before they ran away faster than she's ever seen anyone run. She explained their clothing looked 90s style, and their eyes were completely black, saying that it looked like one giant pupil instead of a pupil with colour around it. She was very adamant on what she saw and never changed her story once, and her daughter backed this up, saying that she saw and heard them too. The next night, a co-worker messaged me on Facebook at around 12:20 as I was off, saying that I needed to call her ASAP. I called and she explained to me that she got caught up counting meds and didn't start her midnight until 12:10. She said when she got to room 133 she heard a tapping on the glass. Knowing what these 2 women have been claiming has been happening to them at night, and she opened the room door the rest of the way and quietly walked in. She got to the window and saw the same teenagers that the residents described, walking away from the window up towards the street, except she said they weren't totally opaque. It was almost as if they were muddy or blurred, and not human. She was so scared that she had called security to come sit with her the rest of her shift, and our security officer did just that. After that week, my co-worker was the only other person besides the mother and daughter, and the last person to ever see those teenagers with black eyes and blurred bodies. After sitting with my co-worker that night, the security guard started patrolling between 11 to 1 a.m., but the teenagers were never seen again. My grandpa's death when I was 7 kind of jump-started whatever latent abilities I had, but this was 3 years later when I was 10. Whether animals or people, death has been a constant part in my life. I prefer to think that some of us are made to comfort the dying or the dead. I watched life leave the eyes of my grandpa, many pets and other humans. This particular day was normal for me. It was the weekend and it was nice out. I remember the phone ringing and my mother came out crying. She told me to get into the car, and we drove to my cousin's house. My family that is still living, my father Tom, mother Charlie, son TJ, and daughter Mary. TJ was the oldest child, Mary was around 14, and the dad was a farmer. TJ would go with his dad and work the fields while Charlie and Mary hung out at home. That particular day, while the father and TJ were out farming, a stranger came to the house. He likely walked from the nearby interstate and murdered Charlie, then sexually assaulted Marie before murdering her too. TJ and his dad came home for lunch to find their bodies. The father is my mother's first cousin, and they were very close. My mother's first instinct was to go to the two and try and comfort them. I remember we had to park in the field because the entire property was swarmed with police and tape and emergency vehicles. I rolled my window down a bit, and my mouth instantly tasted like blood. All I could smell was blood. My mum told me it was okay. She just needed to see her cousin and talk about something and that we would go home. She told me that under no circumstances was I to leave the car, and not to talk to anyone, nor leave the car. She even locked the doors. I just remember looking at their lawn covered in lights and tape and cars, as I knew something really bad must have happened. The ambulance hadn't left yet. My mum was hugging her cousin while he sobbed. TJ was being questioned by a policeman, but he was just staring at the front door with a vacant look on his face. I knew this wasn't a good place to be. I kept tasting blood and wanted to leave. I was contemplating opening my door and just running. I don't know where, but somewhere that wasn't here. Then a very kind-looking policeman knocked on my window and asked where my mum was. I told him she was with her cousin, but I wanted to leave. He opened the door and crouched down and spoke with me. As we talked, I calmed down, and the taste of blood was gone. I could no longer see the front door. Any time I would ask about what was going on, the policeman in navy blue would effortlessly change the subject. Eventually, my mum came back to me and he said bye, and we shut the door. Mum then asked me why I had my door open when she specifically told me not to do so. I told her the policeman was talking to me. She said that there were no police people near the car. I thought about it. He opened a locked car door. He was in a navy blue uniform, and our local police wear brown. Days later, I learned that the murderer had killed Charlie in front of the front door. He shot her in the face. Her blood was on the door that the phantom policeman kept me from seeing. The murders were solved 20 years later. Unfortunately, that lowlife had been hitched up and down a small stretch of interstate, raping and killing women. By the time the DNA was analyzed, the sob was dead. Charlie and Mary didn't get justice, and I have no idea who or what that officer was. I know our farming community started getting better locks and more guns. I know there is a memorial bench for them at my school, and honestly, I hope that sad excuse for a human meat stick gets an eternity of suffering. This takes place circa 2003, California, USA. I was around 16 years old, and we had just moved into a new apartment with my mother, younger brother, and older brother. My parents had recently separated, and things were still rocky for everyone considering my father had actually filed for a divorce without my mother knowing. She had moved to Florida with some family while she got on her feet. So my father handled the whole thing fraudulently and basically kept everything for himself and left my mother with nothing. So there was so much bad blood between them when she returned and became aware of everything he did. Both of my parents are from Mexico, and my mother has no experience with law and procedures, but also had no will to seek legal counsel and have the divorce reversed or to have my father prosecuted for fraud and forgery. Instead, she decided to do what most Hispanic women do, which is seek spiritual counsel from a witch to cast spells on my father, which at one point she sought my own personal approval, which I declined, and was angry at the fact that she would even ask me. I did not think she would actually pull a stunt like that, because prior to the whole separation, she was a devout Jehovah's Witness. But I soon learnt that she had transformed into a completely different person from the time she had left to Florida to the time that she had come back. Some time passed after she asked me about having my father cursed, and I completely forgot about it. That's when I began to have a series of sleep paralysis, which was the typical ones which can be dismissed as just that, until the next two incidents. One day during the summer, it was a hot Sunday, just really boring, so I decided to take a cat nap, and I dreamt that I was about to walk out the front door, and my mother was sleeping on the couch, and suddenly, a shadow figure appeared in between myself and my mother, and I could no longer move, but could see a tall shadow from the corner of my eye when I awoke. Frightened, I ran to the living room to see my mother rising up from the couch with a scared look on her face, and she told me she had a bad dream with the same exact scenario that I had had at that very moment. A few days later one night, I had a dream of a teenage boy about my age, just a randomer, appearing in my dream when I was with a group of friends, and he appeared out of thin air, and we all wondered who he was and where he'd come from. On the same night, I slipped into another dream, this time with the same boy. Only this time, he and I were walking through an empty home, and he was giving me a tour through the house, describing his family and siblings, when suddenly I awoke. My thoughts were that he was a departed soul, perhaps just passing through, and so I thought to myself maybe I should pray, and he wouldn't bother me anymore. And just before I began to pray, I was suddenly gripped by the neck and pinned down. I didn't see anything, but I heard a loud, shrieking whisper in my ear that said, "Shut up." Then I was let go. I shared this incident with a friend of the family, plus the sleep paralysis, and he responded by telling me that the word going around is that your mum is visiting a black magic practitioner to put a curse on your dad, and that perhaps something is attaching to us. I didn't really take it too seriously until the day I was getting my mother's car keys from her purse and found a business card from a witch. I later confronted her about it. I was so angry because of the sleep paralysis became so frequent, and she never responded and just looked away. Even one night when my girlfriend decided to spend the night, she was aware of my sleep paralysis and that it was normal. Now that I knew when I would have those troubling nights even before going to bed, I would get this rush and feel a slight vertigo, and she would stay awake so that she could wake me up when she saw me squirming. We slept in the living room, and my mother had an obsession with dolls, and my girlfriend didn't tell me right away, but later she admitted on that night she stayed over. She saw one of the doll's heads spin a full 360. Around the time I was 8, I lived in a trailer house at the end of the road, so everything was on one floor: living room, kitchen, my parents' room and my bedroom in the other half of the house. But there was an extra bedroom built to the side of the trailer, which was my older sister's room. So when we first moved in, I got some creepy vibes from the house, especially from my room. So that is when I wanted to sleep in my sister's room. Mind you, me and my sister are 7 years apart, and we did not get along until I was 15. So obviously she wasn't really happy about that, but I didn't care. I was always afraid of the dark and being alone. At first I didn't experience anything paranormal. I did things that I've never done before, like sleepwalk. My sister would tell me she would just see me get up, stand there for a while, sit, maybe lay back down and even pee the bed. I would often wake up on the floor. Months later, I would start experiencing paranormal occurrences. The first time I was sound asleep, but for some reason I opened my eyes and saw a boy standing there. He had a grey and blue aura around him, like the ghosts do in cartoons. So since I was a scaredy cat, I ran to my parents' room and cried. After that, I decided to move out of my sister's room and into the room that was supposed to be mine since we moved in. This room was the only room in the house I didn't like to be in alone, after the things that happened, and it was always the coldest room. So my room had a whole wall of a sliding door closet, and it was wood. I would often hear tapping in the night from the closet, and I would tell my sister, but she would just tell me it was because the wood was growing. I wasn't the brightest when I was little, so I brushed it off and the tapping kept happening every other night. But one night I heard a whisper clear as day telling me to turn around. I started crying from fear and wanted to yell for my mum and dad, but I couldn't. Then the last night I slept there, I had sleep paralysis. It was the first and last time I had it. I saw a tall, pure black figure just standing at my door staring at me. And since when you have sleep paralysis you can't move or speak at all, I tried yelling for my mum, and just a gasp would leave my mouth. I don't exactly remember how I came out of it, but I ended up sleeping in the living room for the next few months. More experiences have happened, like my mum would work night shifts, so I would often sleep with my dad, and I would always wake up in the middle of the night because I would feel a big ball of pressure on me and wouldn't be able to speak. But my dad did wake up from my gasps. Another time I was in my parents' room just watching TV while my sister was in hers. Earlier that day, my mum had bought me some cookies and put them in a beautiful glass bowl. My parents left me and my sister, so we decided to put the bowl on the fridge where I couldn't reach it to grab more. I was in my parents' house, which is next to the kitchen, and the bowl just flew off the fridge. My sister came out of her room and began yelling at me. She accused me of trying to grab some or jumping off the bed. I was so chubby, she would have heard me jumping. That's when she was yelling at me, and you had to wind it to play a song that happened to be in the living room next to the TV. But it was at this exact moment that it began to play while both of us were arguing. My sister and I both freaked out and ran to her room and locked ourselves in there until our parents returned. Other little things still happened afterwards, like some of my things disappearing. I also got a puppy that stayed with me all the time called Marley. He would often bark at the room, but I decided that I felt safe with him and me, and he slept in my room till we moved out. He is my best friend till this day, and I'm 21 now. Also, in case you're wondering why I never mentioned telling my parents or sister of my experiences. My mum being the only devoted Christian at the time, my dad being a skeptic, and my sister who was an emo kid and a teenager, I never had anyone to talk about my experiences with until recently, when I told my sister and she was shocked on why I told her. Well, like I said, we never got along until I was 15, and I sure was an annoying little sister. I also told my parents too, but who knows if they actually believe me or think it was just my childhood imagination. But I never watched scary movies until we moved, and now they're my favorite. I never got to know the new owners, and I've wondered if they've ever had experiences like that. We moved to 3 different houses since then, and I never experienced anything remotely paranormal again in my more recent ones. I've lived in this last one with my 3 dogs, including Marley. One last thing. I rarely have nightmares, but when I do, it's always set in that house and in my old room. One of them was me walking down the road at night and looking at my bedroom window, and the closet door would open, and there would be a decapitated head of a man, just there, staring right at me. A few months ago, I heard a strange howling outside. It was the middle of the night. I thought I was hearing the TV upstairs until my grandfather texted me asking what was going on outside. So I grabbed my shotgun and flashlight and went out. It's hard to explain the layout of my property, but when I walked through the door, I walked up the balcony, down the stairs, and across the old volleyball court. It was silent until I got to the edge of where it turns into a steep hill that goes straight down to the beach. That's when the howling started again. I wasn't that scared at first because I thought it might have been a sea lion. They can make weird sounds that almost sound human, so I started walking down the trail that leads from the court to the ocean. I was more or less excited because there has never been any sea lions in the cove where I live, but they are known to be around the area. I got to like the first quarter of the trail, which opens up to a flat spot where we have a few burn barrels and a bone pile, various things to trip over. I was about 60 yards from the house when I heard something sprinting up the trail. I got super spooked at that point and raised my gun up. The sprinting stopped, and I could hear noises moving away from me. This was the longest walk back to the house of my life. I literally inched back to my house, still facing the beach the entire time. When I got back, it started back up again, but it stopped soon after. That was night 1. Almost a week went by and the howling began again around the same time, and I had about the same response: shotgun and flashlight outside. I flashed the light around trying to see anything, but it was too dark, and I tried pulling out my phone to take a video, but the howling stopped, so I went back in. The next night I was out with my dog, and he began growling at the trail, and he slowly started walking towards whatever he was looking at. I heard walking down the trail, then something thumping almost like someone was trying to get to me and my dog to follow me down the beach. I don't use that trail often, if ever. But when I went to the trail the following morning to look, something had definitely been walking through it, so I borrowed some trail cams from my buddy and set them up on the trail in my house to see if I could catch something. And the next day the cams were gone. The day after that, the howling started again. It's like whoever was doing it was trying to get me to the beach. A week goes by. Nothing. Then in the middle of the night I hear what I thought was the wind knocking things around, and the next morning nothing is out of place except muddy smudges on both door window and doorknob and the window next to my bedroom. The next night is a snowstorm, and I hadn't seen or heard anything, almost like whoever they are doesn't want to leave behind footprints. Am I overreacting? Could it have been a bear? I hope so. I'm not much a believer in the supernatural, but I need an explanation. I want to tell you about the creepiest thing that ever happened to me. It's actually a series of a few incidents that have happened over the course of several years. When I was young, I had awoken abruptly in the middle of the night. I had heard my dad call me from downstairs. It was really dark, and I was wondering what he had wanted. I hopped out of bed and flew down the stairs as fast as my little feet would carry me. I had reached the landing and looked out into the darkness and whispered, "Yeah, Dad?" There was no response from behind the darkness. I listened. Then a familiar sound penetrated the blackness of the room. It was my dad's earth-shattering snores. My mum must have kicked him out of the bed for being loud. Confused, I looked towards the kitchen, and for some reason felt compelled to go there. I headed down the hallway into the kitchen to find a small fire starting in the oven. I ran into the living room and shook my dad awake. He put out the fire and took me back to bed. This was the first incident. The second happened several years later. I was on the computer playing RuneScape and chatting with a few friends when I heard my dad call me from upstairs. "Be there in a minute," I called out loud. I headed upstairs into our living room, only to find no one there. Bewildered, I headed over to the stairs figuring he was still in his bedroom. I called up the stairs but got no reply. I started to take a few steps until a familiar rumble was heard in the distance. He was asleep. He didn't call me. I was a little freaked out at this point and had remembered what happened years later. I stood in silence for a few moments until I heard a knock at the door. I froze. It was 11:30 p.m. Why would anyone be knocking on doors this late? I might have answered it too, if it were not for what had just creeped me out. I went over to the window and looked out and saw two larger middle-aged men. I went back to my computer to tell my creepy tale to my RuneScape friends. A few days later, I had discovered that several houses in my neighborhood had been robbed, and people had been hurt. Turns out they received a knock on the door late at night, only to have the men push their way into the house and rob them. This was incident number 2. Another few years later, I was heading home from a friend's house late at night. It was getting very dark, and it was a bit foggy as it was fall. There are 2 ways to walk home from my friend's house, one significantly longer than the other. Normally, I would take the longer way when it was dark, as I felt it safer. But I was really tired and wanted to get home, so I figured why not? Let's take the shortcut. I began walking down the shortcut, which was basically a path that cut through the long way. It was very foggy, and you could only see so far, when all of a sudden, almost as if within the soundtrack itself, I heard someone, a male's voice, shout my name so loud, I threw down my headphones and they hit the ground. I nervously took a long look around for a moment, but no one was there. I swore I'd heard it though. Male voices screaming my name. It sounded so distressed. I looked down the path now, too afraid to continue down it. A lone figure appeared through the fog, almost exactly like this was out of some sort of horror movie. You best believe I turned tail and ran until I got home. This was incident number 3. The final incident happened only a few years ago. I made a friend who enjoyed all things paranormal, and she was always researching and looking into situations that involved anything of the like. She had convinced me to let her try to do some sort of contact with the spirit world to see if I had anything following me. As I had mentioned, I had thought it in the past. I had experienced some paranormal activities, but I had never mentioned to her these stories. She took the pendant I wore around my neck and used it as a pendulum and swung over words and letters, and apparently it was supposed to spell out things or say words like a big Ouija board. She began asking a few general questions. I wasn't really paying attention, although it did interest me a little. I didn't truly believe it at all. Until she spelled out 3 words: fire, door, and path. I freaked out a little, and I think my friend knew by the look on my face. I then went to tell her exactly what I had experienced with the male who sounded like my dad calling my name. We both got very freaked out and decided it would be best to leave the rest of our questions unanswered. Since that day, I haven't experienced anything else that I can recall, but I still do think back to those times and try to figure them out, but still have been unable to. It was around 10:30 p.m. Zay, my son, would not go to sleep as he was restless and fighting his usual sleep schedule. Kids, what are you gonna do? When his mum was in the kitchen making dinner when he decided to spontaneously awake, I decided to focus on getting him back to sleep. I picked him up out of his crib and thought I saw a human-shaped shadow in the corner of my room. But because I was moving so fast to get him and to make a bottle, I didn't notice too much. After trying to sit down on the couch and feed him his bottle on it, I realized that it wasn't going to work. So I let my wife know that I was going to go to his bedroom to try and feed him and get him to sleep. So I went in, sat down in my rocking chair and tried to feed him with the door to the kitchen open. After realizing that it wasn't going to work with the door open, I stood up, walked over to the door and shut it. The room became pitch black. Now I'm not afraid of the dark, I should make this clear. So I shut the door and sat back down in the rocking chair and started to rock back and forth, hoping to get Zay to sleep. He kept on moving from side to side trying to get comfortable, and he was. I looked up to try and give him a bit more space and for his head to lay on my chest. As I picked my head up, I looked towards the corner of the room when I saw a human-like figure from the floor standing ominously in the corner. At that moment, I didn't feel scared, more protective than anything. I wanted to ask why it was there, but out of respect and tiredness and not wanting to wake up my son, I just stared at it, and it stared back at me. At least 15 minutes went by just rocking in the chair, staring at this entity, and it never moved once. Enter my cat Missy. It pushed open the door, and as soon as the light hit it, I watched it evaporate into nothingness. It was gone, and the cat pushing the door woke Zane up. So I shooed her out, closed the door, all the while holding him. I sat back down, looked at the corner, as my son put his head onto my chest and went back to sleep. The thing then formed again, out of the floor, and we continued the stare-off for another 5 minutes, until my cat opened the door again, and once again, it vanished. This time I decided to leave the room with Zay in my arms and his bottle in my right hand. That was the last time I saw it, but I think it still lingers around. Both my wife and I feel it in his room every time we go in there day or night, whoever or whatever it is. At least it doesn't seem malicious. I've had several paranormal experiences through my childhood and adulthood that were and still are unexplainable. I never thought my childhood home itself was bad. My parents bought the house and moved into the acreage when I was 1 to 2 years old. The original owners built the house, but we were the first to live in it, if that makes sense. I always thought the land was bad. We lived less than 1/4 of a mile from my dad's pasture, and the pasture had wagon trails through it. Though I don't have proof, we always thought they were Oregon Trail imprints. The energy was off, but it was beautiful and the scenery drew you in. As I said before, I had more than one experience at that particular house. The first story that comes to mind is when I was a teenager between the ages of 13 and 14. I was home alone. The house was a single story with an unfinished basement. The basement had 2 bedrooms with carpet and drywall. The remainder of the basement was cement flooring and cement blocks with exposed beams and wires. We had a common area with a TV, foosball table, and computer desk, but the majority of the basement was used for storage. I was home alone, for one of the first times. I almost always had an older sister home, so I wasn't usually alone, but this time I really was. My mum and dad were gone for the day, about an hour and a half away, and my 16 to 17-year-old sister had gone to see her boyfriend. I was enjoying my time alone. I was blaring my rock music as loud as it could go, trying to sing along and hit the high notes in Atreyu's lead, sails, and paper anchors. I'm nailing it, and not really paying attention to anything that's going on around me, when all of a sudden I hear my sister's voice say, "Hey," the way she always did. I turned down my music and yelled up the stairs, "What?" expecting her to come down and tell me what she needed me for. But she never came. Confused, I walked upstairs and looked around, calling her, and I froze when I saw that the front door remained locked, and her car wasn't in the driveway. The second story I'll share tonight is from the summer of 2009. I was 14. I remember the time of year because my aunt passed away from lung cancer that July. She had breast cancer that was in remission for 10 years. When we noticed it the second time, it was already in her brain. My aunt was childless, but treated all of us like we were her own. She was a hugely positive part of my childhood. She was my safe place. I've never handled death in the way that you might. I find relief in death and cry out of happiness for the person so they are no longer in pain, and for their loved ones left behind. I didn't cry for myself. I had to tell myself to cry when I simply felt relief so that I wouldn't stand against my weeping sisters. No matter how I felt, I was missing a very important woman in my life now. I would go through phases of moving my furniture around the room to unusual places. At one point my bed was centered in the room. I don't have a headboard, and on the wall opposite of the bedroom door was a closet. I centered my vanity. This vanity was vintage and heavy. The mirror was textured from age around the edges and would reflect the majority of the room. I went to bed on my bed, in the center of the room, and woke up that next morning just as the sun was beginning to rise. My window faced the west, but the sun hadn't filled the room just yet, only about halfway. I woke up, with my back to the closet, and bedroom door and my face towards the mirror. I rubbed my eyes and stretched before looking in the mirror. In the reflection stood my auntie in a white robe. Her hair looked beautiful. She wore wigs and bandanas towards the end of her life, a chocolate brown color cut in a long bob. She was bright and beautiful, and I was immediately very terrified. It was my aunt, but I knew she was gone. I covered my face and body with my quilt and waited. I felt pressure on my mattress and felt someone get on the bed along with me. I felt knees on each side of me straddling me. I was petrified and didn't trust that it was really her. She never said anything to me, but I felt her there for the moment, and I fell asleep hiding under the covers and woke up again later that morning. I believe it was my aunt visiting me to let me know that she was okay, and I felt terrible that she scared me. I haven't seen her since, but I'm fully aware of her presence at times. She and Grandma have always loved that I keep cats. I worked in a cafe that was retrofitted into a very old building downtown. One day I was in the walk-in fridge in the horrible, unfinished basement. I had the door open and was gathering up whatever I needed when I saw out of the corner of my eye a white shape move past the door. My immediate reaction was, "Oh, that's just Chris the waiter in his white shirt, no big deal." It was only several hours later that I realized, 1, Chris had never come downstairs, as I asked. 2, Chris was wearing a blue shirt that day, and since we had been working together for half the shift, I knew that. 3, if he had walked past that door in that direction, he'd have walked straight into a wall. What strikes me about this situation is that it was a totally illogical conclusion to arrive at, and I should have been freaked out by the anomalies, but instead calmly leapt to a faulty explanation. I think the whatever it was messed with my head, radiating "I'm something harmless and familiar" vibes. I had a friend who died of AIDS in the 90s, before we had so much knowledge about the disease, or the excellent pharmaceuticals of today. He was such a wonderful man, joyful, loving, and as he got sicker, his friends and I set up a roster of folks to bring food and visit him. He died in a period where I hadn't seen him for 2 weeks and I felt terribly guilty. Besides grieving him, I was so sad I hadn't said goodbye. Guilty I hadn't signed up for a roster spot in those last 2 weeks, and ashamed that one of the reasons I hadn't signed up was my horror at what the disease had done to him. About a week later, I woke up with a feeling of joy and forgiveness with a touch of goodbye. I'm sure it was Brent. I'm not an especially joyful person and I don't generally give up on guilt. It would just be like Brent, to go on nurturing his friends even after death. That's what I have, and what I can't explain after 60 years of skepticism. I've heard ghost stories my whole life from my mum and other family members, but never seen anything myself. That's until my family moved into our house in 2007. Right from the beginning, the house was dark, gloomy, and cold. We moved into the house in July, and I needed a sweater to feel comfortable. We live in Michigan, and July is one of our hottest months. It all started with seeing things from the corner of my eye, but not really seeing what it was, just knowing that it wasn't normal and that nothing should be there. Soon things would not be where I put them, looking on my desk at least 3 to 4 times, and finally finding it 10 minutes later sitting right in the middle of my desk in the open. Little things here and there, but always the feeling of being watched. I could never just walk into a room like a normal person would. I would stop at the doorway and peep inside to make sure that nothing was there. Then I found myself tiptoeing and peering more and more. Then I started seeing a black mist. It would almost always come from down the hall from the back of the house. There's one bedroom and bathroom down that hall, and go into the kitchen. Our basement door is located in the kitchen and also straight across from our side entrance door. I was walking through the kitchen to yell something down the basement to my husband when all of a sudden something came rushing up to me. I fell to my knees, covered my head and screamed. I could feel it go right over me so fast. One night my husband and I were watching TV, and here comes the mist down the hall and go into the kitchen. I screamed to my husband, "You saw that! You have to have seen it!" He admitted he had seen it before, and also said sometimes he would hear me yell for him, and when he would come to see what I needed, that I would be asleep on the couch or not even home yet. But he insisted that it was definitely my voice. Just a few months ago, my husband and oldest son were in the kitchen talking. My husband leaned against the sink, and my son leaned against the counter. My husband says that he saw a black shadow looking at them from the doorway to the dining room. He looks over to see if our son sees it, and he's just standing there with his mouth open looking right at it. My son says that he was looking at it, and when the shadow realized what they saw, that it backed up from the doorway really fast and vanished. My little guy, he's an 8-year-old, and was a premature baby at 26 weeks, only weighing 2 pounds at birth. He's smaller than an average 8-year-old and more babyish. He has high blood pressure, and when he gets upset, he passes out. So, we keep these things from him. One night he comes to me and says that I'm going crazy, and I ask him why. He says he thinks he just saw a black thing sitting at the dining room table. When he was younger, he would come running to me crying, saying he saw something. I tried to catch it on video, so I set my phone in the kitchen, and I didn't get it on camera, but I did get a voice recording of it talking. So creepy.
I'll find you again. One more shot.
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's video. I'd like to give a huge thanks to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen for your continued help and contributions. You guys are amazing, and I love you. And everyone else who just watches to the end, that's pretty cool. I hope you enjoyed today's video. You know what to do if you did. Yeah, I'm pretty tired. I'm going to work really hard to try and make sure this video comes out just a little bit later, because I left it a little bit too late because Pandora didn't have a whole night's sleep, and that was a bit earlier and kind of messed up my schedule a little bit. But there you have it. Alright then guys, so if you enjoyed tonight's video, feel free to watch another one. It's on screen now, just feel free to click one. They're pretty good, I've been told. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next.